Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our webinar, Building Your Community, Sourcing and Using Funding Effectively. As long as I've been involved in politics, the most often question I get from people is, how do you access funding and how do you go about applying for it? On one side, you have community groups who want to find the funding to do their project, and on the other side, you have funding agencies only desperate to get talking to as many community groups as possible so that they get the best applications forward so that they can have the best proposals and the best projects funded. I'm delighted to be here tonight with a number of key speakers who will talk to us about where the funding is, how to approach sourcing it, and also the best practice in terms of community development. Tonight, I'm delighted to have with us as our keynote speaker, Minister for Rural and Community Development, Minister Humphreys TD. Also, head of the Irish Regional Europeans Office, Teresa Lennon, Alan McAdam, who's Principal Consultant at MCA Consulting, and Enda McGloin from Shamrock Community Development from County Leitrim. Each of the panellists will be given approximately 7 minutes to give us an overview of their perspective on it. And then we go to a question and answer session after that, where we get really into the meat of the issues. So first up is our keynote speaker. She's a lifelong commitment to the development of communities. Earlier this year, she launched Our Rural Future, a forward-looking, ambitious framework for the development of rural Ireland over the next 5 years. I'm delighted to introduce Minister Humphreys.
Thank you, Colm, and thank you. Good evening, everybody. And I'm delighted to be joining such an esteemed panel of contributors here this evening. It's great that you're hosting this webinar, Colm. And I'm joining you here from my office in Leinster House. And Colm, I know you're in Strasbourg this evening. And while so many others on the call are joining us from different parts of the country, and that really does show us how these online meetings are a great way to get together in the midst of a pandemic. I note the first part of this webinar's title is Building Your Community. And that really is the core principle of the government's new rural policy, which you have already mentioned, Colm, called Our Rural Future, which I launched last March. Our Rural Future is the most ambitious rural development strategy for decades, and it's already having a really positive impact across the country. And I've spent the last number of months getting out of Dublin and into rural Ireland, where I have really been impressed by the can-do, the positive attitude that really exists in our rural communities. Because I know people want strong communities. They want their towns and villages to be doing and looking well, and they want to make rural Ireland a better place to live, work, and raise a family. Our Rural Future is about supporting all of those objectives and reimagining what rural Ireland is all about. And I'm absolutely delighted that we're going to be hosting the OECD conference next year on rural communities. So that is something that we're very pleased to do. And I think it's a recognition of what we have been doing through Our Rural Future. But I know that all of these things can only happen in terms of investment in rural Ireland. And that's why, as Minister, I was really pleased last month to secure the largest ever budget package for rural and community development, totaling €376 million. Importantly, we are in a position to put the funding in place that allows me to expand each and every one of our rural development schemes. So that includes town and village renewal, CLAR, outdoor recreation, LEADER, and the Rural Regeneration Development Fund, which many of you will be aware of. For me, I was really pleased to secure budget funding to appoint the first ever town regeneration officers. And these will be people on the ground working with you and assisting communities in securing investment and delivering the projects for your areas. And I really think the appointment of town regeneration officers is important, because I know when communities are seeking funding, they don't often know who they need to turn to for that piece of advice or indeed a nudge in the right direction. So I envisage by next year, there will be a town regeneration officer in place in every county who will act as a link between the local authority, my department, and communities themselves. A big focus of mine throughout the pandemic has been the development of our outdoor amenities and our remote working infrastructure. And as we all know, our outdoor amenities have been a godsend to us all during COVID, whether it's our trails, our walkways, our blueways, our cycleways, our greenways. We have all really learned the importance of these projects in terms of our physical and mental well-being. And I was delighted in September to visit the beautiful St. Declan's Way in Waterford to announce an additional 31 trails under my department's walk scheme. This is a scheme that has been in place since 2008 and involves financial supports being provided to farmers and landowners to maintain and upkeep these walkways that go through their holding. It's a scheme that's all about working closely with our farming community so that we can open up parts of rural Ireland, which is really important in terms of tourism. When it comes to our works, of course, we're not just talking about St. Declan's Way. We have the Dingle Way in Kerry, the Ballyhura Way in County Limerick, the South Leinster Way in County Kilkenny, the Wicklow Uplands Way and the Durrow Leafy Loop in County Sligo, and that's just naming a few. And similar, of course, to the town regeneration officers, I also announced the appointment of 8 additional rural recreation officers, bringing the total number nationwide to 21. So these will be crucial in terms of driving forward the expansion of the walks scheme, which is a big priority of mine in the months ahead. Some of you will know already that I'm a big believer and a big supporter of remote working. And I know, Colm, that you too have a big interest in this area. And from my perspective as Minister, I'm supporting remote working hubs by developing an infrastructure called Connected Hubs. This is a single network of over 150 remote working facilities that gives people the options to work within their own communities, regardless of where their employer is headquartered. It's about giving the people the choice of blended working, perhaps spending a day or two a week in their local hub and avoiding that grueling commute each morning and evening. And by giving people that choice to work from within their own communities, we can revitalise the centres of our towns and villages by attracting people back to rural Ireland. And we can also, really revitalise our communities. We breathe new life in, we bring young people back with their families. We can also reduce commuting times, lower transport emissions, and most importantly, improve the quality of life for our people. In July, I announced over 8.9 million in funding through Connected Hubs. And having visited so many of the hubs that have secured funding, I can tell you that I really believe the future of remote working is through the development of these hub facilities. And indeed, only last week, I visited a hub in Scottstown in my own county, and it's amazing what's happening there. There's a girl there, she worked in Cork, she's from Monaghan, now she's working and living in Monaghan, working remotely from a hub. And there are other people working for multinationals. So that's the beauty of it. You live, you work in your community, and you can really have high quality jobs that you can take up with multinationals and other employers right across the country. And then, of course, the other funding stream is the Rural Regeneration Development Fund. We're supporting communities in repurposing old and derelict buildings, turning them into the state-of-the-art remote working facilities, and indeed for other purposes as well. I recently visited the old Ritz Cinema in Ballybofey, and through the Rural Regeneration Development Fund, this old cinema is going to be turned into an impressive digital hub, which I believe can be a game changer for the area. And finally, when it comes to funding, I often get asked about community centres. I do intend to launch a new funding scheme for community centres early in the new year, a scheme I expect there will be huge demand for, because one thing that we have taken away from COVID is that sense of community resilience that really rings true, as we know, in rural Ireland. So I hope that gives you a brief overview of the huge amount that has been going on in terms of rolling out our rural future and ensuring that we bring investment into rural communities. Colm, I just want to commend you for the work that you are doing at an EU level as our MEP for Midlands-North-West. I know that you're deeply passionate about issues relating to rural affairs, and I know that you will be an excellent advocate for rural Ireland in both Brussels and Strasbourg. And I just want to commend you on the huge amount of work that you're doing. You're out there, you're on the ground, you're listening to people, and you're bringing those issues to a higher level, as I said, in Brussels and Strasbourg. So I just want to thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you this evening. Gurmil Mahkov.
Thank you very much, Minister. Delighted that you took the time to join us. I know you have limited time, so while we'll maybe come to all the rest of the speakers in a little while, and I would say to the people on the chat and the audience, if you can put your questions in the chat, we'll come to them afterwards. We won't be going to the individual audience members. We'll just put them in the chat and we can ask them of the panelists here. But just before you do leave us, Minister, you talked about some very interesting things there. Particularly, I thought when you talked about like the town regeneration officers and the rural recreation officers. Like the whole thing that people need in these organisations is a link and a bit of support to make these things happen. So I suppose in relation to the town regeneration officer, can you tell us just a little bit more about them? And if it's their local town, how do they go about maybe getting to know and beginning to take advantage of this opportunity?
Thanks, Colm. Yeah, well, we haven't, we have rolled out funding to appoint them in local authorities. And it'll be up to the local authority to appoint that local person. But what we want them to do is we want to do the joined up thinking. We're always talking about it, but sometimes it just doesn't happen as easily as we might like. So they'll be able to look at the wider plan for the area and look at connecting different sources of funding. So whether it's through my department or maybe different schemes within my department, working with obviously Leader as well, because I know that Leader do a lot of work in terms of building capacity within communities, and that's something that they're very much focusing on in this new round of funding, because the most important thing, and I've seen it on many occasions, is that communities need to know how to work together, and they need a plan. So the town regeneration officer will be looking at that plan. A lot of towns have plans, and it's to make sure that we work through those plans and achieve a better town, a better place to live, a better place to do business, and it's all joined up together like that.
I have to commend you for the idea, because I think it's clear over the years that you've always understood rural development, and the idea of putting that person that joins the dots together or looks at the plans that are already in place and actions them rather than writing a whole new plan. And maybe, it's bringing those people together and enabling. And I suppose the message to people is contact your local county council, and that's where you'll make contact. In relation to the rural recreation officer, it's a similar scenario, is it? Rural recreation has so many, like between greenways and blueways and everything, there's so many opportunities in rural recreation at this stage. I don't know if you want to comment on some of them maybe as well.
Yeah, the rural recreation officers are mainly connected to the Leader or to the local development companies. And what my plan is that not every county needs a rural recreation officer. Some of them can share them with other counties. It depends on the size of the county. We have appointed a number of new rural recreation officers across the country, and we'll continue to review that. Again, there's a lot of their main purpose will be engaging with landowners. Because if we don't have the cooperation and the goodwill of the landowners, we're going nowhere. So that's what the rural recreation officers will continue to work with them and look at where we need to maybe link up walks because there are so many walks right across this country, and it wouldn't take an awful lot to link many of them up. Again, forward planning, thinking what we need to do, consulting with people on the ground and working with people on the ground. So that'll be the purpose of the rural recreation officers.
And finally, just one other question, I suppose, in relation to both, if you like, the remote working in the community centres. Like, you very much painted the picture there in terms of the potential it has to local communities, to bring people back, the investment in the local community. That is, I always say, but be it playing on the local football team or buying your coffee in the local shop or whatever the situation may be, they have a real they do make a real difference. And equally, a community centre, it's the heart of community. In terms of the two of them working together, do you see a synergy between, let's say, in local communities where community centres can work closely, or even those behind the community centres can work closely in developing a remote working hub, or do you see them as two separate entities?
No, what I see here is, first of all, we have the remote working facilities. They're called all sorts of different names. They could be called digital hubs, co-working spaces. But what we have done is we have launched this Connected Hubs initiative. And what we're trying to do is bring all of those different facilities together on one app, so that, you know, if you go into a particular area and you want to access accommodation, whether it's on a permanent basis or whether it's on just maybe on a daily basis, that you know exactly where those facilities are available, and you can book your desk or you can book your office. You can do this all online through this app. So then, of course, what we have is that's called the Connected Hubs. We have been supporting them. These are both privately run hubs and publicly owned ones. And on top of all that, then we have the broadband connection points, which we have been rolling out in community centres that don't have high-speed broadband. And that's something that has really taken off. We've been working with the broadband officers in the local authorities. For example, if you're in one of these areas where your broadband is poor, you want to work remotely, you want to live in your community, you can do that in your local community hall. So it's about connecting all of the different layers together and giving people that opportunity and that facility to work remotely, because I am absolutely convinced that this is the way to revitalise rural Ireland. And if you look over newspaper cuttings for the last 40, 50 years to say rural Ireland is dying, well, I can tell you it's not dying. This is the game changer. We have to grasp it. We have to hold on to it now. And people want quality of life. And what better quality of life than you get in our rural areas? We've invested hugely in our outdoor recreation. We've invested in our towns and our public realm. You couldn't get a better place to live than rural Ireland. I'm absolutely committed to it. And I know it can work, and we're going to make it work. Thank you.
Just before you finish, actually, because there's a couple of questions coming in the chat and I'd hate them not to be dealt with. Damien Boylan has asked about the local improvement scheme and the community involvement schemes being available in urban and city areas. I think they come through the county council, mostly available in rural areas. He's wondering, can they be made available in urban areas? And also, I'll just give you the two together. Sarah Riley is on about, Councillor Sarah Riley from Meath is on about the footpaths were previously eligible under town and village. And she's wondering, this year they've been ruled out in a lot of town and village schemes, and maybe the basis for that, or could they be reintroduced?
Thanks for those questions. Sorry, can you hear me all right?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, well, first of all, footpaths. The Town and Village Fund funded footpaths as far as I'm concerned, footpaths is the job of the local authority to fund. What I'm funding from my department is an add-on. But we have funded footpaths, and I think that footpaths for Town and Village lacks imagination. If all the local authorities can come up with is a footpath, well, I think that they should be looking, they should be taking a broader view. And as I said, there was many footpaths funded. I wouldn't like to give you the figure of how many new footpaths we've put in. And I know they have been extremely useful and they were needed. But to me, footpaths is the same as the footpaths is the job of the local authority. So when I see town and village, I want to see projects that bring new life back into the towns and villages, and that are innovative and that they're outside the box, because we can do it, and there's no doubt about it. In terms of the community
CIS schemes,
LIS and CIS. Well, LIS is funded. LIS is particularly targeted at local community, at rural areas, and in fairness to the people in rural areas that live in the long lanes and they need access to their farms. That's the purpose of it, to bring the produce out. I'm not the urban fund falls under the Department of Local Government, and you know, that's where the funding comes from there. The local improvement scheme was reintroduced by my predecessor, Michael Ring. It had been closed for many years. It was in the Department of Transport. I'd love if they'd match the funding that I have in our pot. But anyway, I'll keep going and try and get, there's a long waiting list in every single county in the country. I doubled the funding, or I put in additional funding last year. There was over 20 million available. It did make a dent in the lists. The funding this year, I think is about, I just haven't got the figure here off the top of my head, but it's available there. And sorry, 11 million is the funding for this year. It's been distributed across the different local authorities. Well, they got 21 million last year. So the next funding announcement will be in 2022, but it's specifically targeted at rural areas.
Just, I have to echo your comments in relation to the town and village. I think people need to be more creative. It's great to get that money into your towns and villages, and they have to have something good to show for it at the other end. Just one other question, just to touch very quickly. It's your own area. Michael Tobin is asking about rural regeneration Category 2 grants. When will the call come out for them, is what he's asking.
The Category 2 rural regeneration, I'll be announcing those in the next number of weeks. That's the Category 2. The call for Category 1 will be going out, hopefully it'll be going out before Christmas. So that's for new projects, but Category 2 is being it will be announced in the next couple.
Just I suppose for people's background, Category 1 is more or less feasibility, and then Category 2 is around the funding of the project itself. Essentially, would that be?
Yeah. Well, the purpose of it is Category 2 is to put the plans in place. It might be to acquire maybe a piece of property, it might be to work with design, it might be to get an agreement with landlords or other property owners. It's to pull the project together, and then it puts you in a very strong position to put in an application for Category 1. So the next funding announcement will be the third call. The fourth call. The next call for funding will be the fourth call for Category 1. So I'll be announcing Category 2 shortly, but I'll also be putting out a call then for Category 1 funding.
There's plenty more questions here for you, but I think we'll have to move on to Teresa at this stage, and maybe we'll fire over the questions and maybe get back to people with individual answers in due course as well, if that's possible. I'm sure we can get back to them that way. So thanks very much for taking the time. Really appreciate it. It's great to have you. As ever, you're on top of your brief. It's been brilliant to work with you because your heart is in rural development. And I think that's so important. So listen, thanks again, Minister. And I'll pass it on next to Teresa Lennon, who, as I said, was the head of the Irish Region's European Office in Brussels. Really, I suppose, it's a brilliant support service that's available, and that's very much the bridge between local and regional government and European funding. Widely recognised as something of an expert on European funding, Teresa, what I find about her, she's great at explaining the framework of where all the funding sits together and the different channels of funding. And I think anyone who takes the bit of time to listen to her, they'll understand the different routes and the different ways to approach the funding. So, Teresa, I'll leave it over to you. I know you're better at explaining it than I am.
Thank you very much, Colm, and good evening, everyone. I'm going to attempt to share the slides and talk you through them. So, hopefully everyone can see that okay. Yes, so thank you, Colm, and good evening, everyone. My name is Teresa Lennon, and I'm head of the Irish Region's European Office in Brussels. So I'm coming to you from Brussels tonight. And really, before I start going through some of the EU funding opportunities, I'm very glad that the Minister had gone through all of the rural development schemes that are in Ireland. I'll be looking more on the European side. And as Colm said, it's a complex environment, but we're here to help you through it. So firstly, just to say what the Irish Region's European Office is. We are a shared service of the 3 regional assemblies in Ireland. So we have, you see on the map, the Northern and Western region, the Eastern and Midlands region, and the Southern region. So we act as that bridge between the regional assemblies and the 31 local authorities in Ireland. And we follow policy developments that are happening here in Brussels and feed that information back. And also obviously assist with funding queries. That's one part of our role. And the other part of our role is to support and coordinate the Irish delegation to the Committee of the Regions. So if you're not aware, we have 9 full members and 9 alternate members who represent Ireland in the Committee of the Regions. And the Committee of the Regions is an EU institution which aims to ensure that local and regional issues are taken into consideration in the development of EU policy. Now, just to look briefly, because I only have limited time this evening, but to look at the funding opportunities. And I like this slide because it kind of gives you the overview of the complexity and the different range of funding programs that are available. So it's almost like thinking about any policy area that exists within the EU policy sphere almost has a funding programme. So be it looking after the environment through the LIFE programme, or health, the Health for Growth programme, the Rights programme, the Justice programme, the Erasmus Plus, the SME programme, all of which I'm sure you would be interested in. And then the other family of programmes, which I have here in the red box, is the regional policy funding. And that's, I suppose, traditionally where rural communities and the regions in Ireland are particularly interested in these funding programmes. Now, they're the ones I'm going to talk to you about tonight. And really to say that they're all very much at a drafting stage in the latter end of their drafting of their programs. So I'm going to talk you through what their draft themes are in these programs, but obviously they may be subject to change as negotiations and final programs are approved by the member states and the European Commission. So you're probably very familiar. Oh, sorry, I should say before I move on, all funding programmes are expected to contribute to the objectives of the EU Green Deal. And I know there was a question in the chat there about adhering to climate objectives. So the EU's Green Deal of being a climate neutral continent by 2050. So it's really important that all of the work that you may be doing in any of these funding programmes has a very strong focus on meeting the objectives of that Green Deal. In terms of the regional policy funding, we call it cohesion policy. That's the entire family of the programmes that look at European regional development funding, and you're probably aware of that. Some of that will come through your government departments and some will come through the likes of the local authorities. The priorities for the next 7 years are around a smarter Europe through innovation, digitalisation, economic transformation and support to small and medium businesses, and then a greener carbon-free Europe. So obviously that will be no surprise, the energy transition, fight against climate change. And then looking at a more connected Europe with strategic transport and digital networks. Another then important priority is looking at a social Europe and delivering on the European pillar of social rights and supporting quality employment, education, skills and social inclusion and access to healthcare. And then the final one is a Europe closer to its citizens. So looking at those locally led development strategies and supporting those, really a bottom-up approach to having citizens involved in shaping their local areas, and obviously through some of the work that you'll be involved in, that's a key one. I should also say that and this is slightly complex, but some programs are called shared management programs. So that means there's an allocation of funding given to the member state. So in this, obviously, our case, Ireland, and the program is managed by the government in Ireland and by various government departments, depending on the fund, and by the European Commission. So we call it the shared management programs. And the two I'm just going to briefly mention because they will start to filter out over the next number of years to local areas are the European Regional Development Fund, and that's 396 million euros for the next 7 years for Ireland. And of those 5 objectives I outlined earlier, Ireland was asked to pick 3. So they've chosen a smarter Europe, a greener carbon-free Europe, and a Europe closer to its citizens. So as we speak in the weeks and months, the regional assemblies, the Northern Western Regional Assembly and the Southern Regional Assembly will be the managing authorities for these programmes going forward. And they are working really closely with the various government departments, particularly the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, on setting the priorities for what these programmes are going to fund and the schemes that they're going to fund. And obviously, we're ensuring as regional assemblies that there is a focus on the regions, on getting the funding out on the ground. You may or may not be aware that regional assemblies have a regional, spatial and economic strategy, which forms the basis for their interventions and the policy background, if you like, and the policy document to ensuring that funding is being distributed across the country. I also briefly mentioned the National Recovery and Resilience Facility, which is the EU's support to all member states following the pandemic. And Ireland has received or will receive €989 million in grants for 2021 and 2022. And Ireland's plan will be supporting energy efficiency, sustainable mobility, biodiversity, and ecosystems, and the digitalisation of public administration and businesses, and contributing to upskilling. So some of what the Minister talked about in terms of digitalisation and rural hubs and all of that, some of that may eventually be funded from this programme as well. So moving very swiftly on, and I realise I'm racing through this, and I normally could do a day on any one of these programmes, it should be said. These are the European Territorial Cooperation Programmes, I'm going to call them, but you probably all call them Interreg, and we all call them Interreg in our sort of day-to-day lives. And Interreg takes many guises. In fact, there are about 70 Interreg programmes in operation across Europe. And just to confuse us all, there's cross-border cooperation programmes, there's transnational cooperation programmes, and there's interregional cooperation programmes. In terms of cross-border programmes, you're probably familiar with the Peace programme for Northern Ireland and the border region of Ireland. And there was an Interreg cross-border programme, which some of you may have availed of. That's all now been put into a Peace Plus programme, which is going to look at economic and social cohesion. And I'm very briefly going to touch on that later. In terms of transnational cooperation, you may or may not be aware, but Ireland is participating in a number of programmes, the Atlantic Area Programme, the North-West Europe Programme, and the Northern Periphery and Arctic Programme. So there are the 3 zones that Ireland, because of its geography, can participate in. And then my last one is interregional cooperation, which is another programme, and lots of local authorities in particular have been involved now, where you can pick your partner from anywhere across Europe. And I'll talk very briefly about those in a moment. One of the things I think is really important is to understand the characteristics of Interreg programmes. They all have different priorities, and if I have time, briefly touch on those. But you really have to have an issue or a problem that needs solved and not just within your own local community. It has to be a transnational issue. It has to be a problem that needs others to collaborate, and there has to be a European added value for it. So all of these different schemes are managed by different organisations across Europe, but effectively it's the EU giving you a grant, and they want to know what the added value is that you're going to bring and what you're going to deliver in your local community. And I don't want you to think that these are not within your reach. They're very much within your reach in your local community groups, in your local authorities, wherever you are. They're very, very much within your reach, and Ireland has a really good track record in accessing these programmes. The calls for the proposals run during the 7 years. There's no real fixed timescales for those. And as I said, you need to have a reason to partner, and you need to have a reason for working with other member states. So it may be that, you're doing an energy efficiency project and you're learning from someone in Finland or Germany or wherever it might be, but there needs to be a clear role for each partner. All of these projects, these European territorial cooperation programs, except the cross-border programme, I should say, which is 100% match funded, and that's because of the UK because of the Irish and Northern Irish governments put the match funding in that programme. But the other transnational and interregional programmes require an element of match funding, and I always get the question, where do I get the match funding from? And I think, you know, it's fair to say that the schemes allow you to put your staff time in as match funding. So that helps then in terms of where you get your funding, your match funding. But you need to have a clear aim and objective, and you need to be able to measure the success, and that needs to be tangible success. Very, very briefly, the Peace Programme. I'll leave you with the slides about what it's going to support. But as I said, it's an economic and social programme this time, delivering economic regeneration, looking at healthy and inclusive communities, looking at embedding partnerships and collaboration on a cross-border area. I've included the map that SEUPB have used for the current the recent consultation about where the recipients of peace funding have been in the last 7 years. So the programme is for Northern Ireland and the border region of Ireland, but you can see that there are participants further beyond the actual border region. So that may offer opportunities. It's a larger programme this time than the other two programmes previously combined. So there's an opportunity perhaps for others within what SUPB would define as a functional area, as opposed to just the eligible area. The Northwest Europe programme, you can see by the geography of this programme, it's the island of Ireland and parts of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. And parts of Germany. This programme is very much about connectivity and looking, and it's not, you know, some people think it's quite an urban programme. It's not, it's about urban and rural areas, because there are urban and rural areas within this programme geography. It's looking at a smart and, as you would imagine, the circular economy, smart energy, and a transition towards a socially inclusive and resilient society. So opportunities for sure within this programme. This one I think is a really good, and it's a really good starter programme. It's a little bit smaller than the others, but I know when I think of the geography of Europe, I don't always think about who lives above us in terms of Europe. So this programme is about, as the name suggests, rurality and peripherality, and how we learn to live together, manage our resources together, and how we build attractive northern periphery communities, and you know, happy to take questions or answer some further on any of these, but this one is particularly a good starter one if you haven't dipped your toe in the area before. The Atlantic Area programme then, similar. Its name kind of gives it away. You need to take out the UK out of this map. I couldn't find a current map, but the UK will no longer participate in this programme, obviously, since it's left the EU. So you can see it's Atlantic facing regions. It's looking at the maritime economy. It's looking at tourism. It's looking at culture. It's looking at smart specialisation. It's looking at how do we enhance and use the maritime economy and the maritime environment to enhance all of the cooperation. And the Interreg Europe programme, as I said, it's where you can partner with other parts of anywhere in Europe. There's no defined area for you. But this is about sharing policy experience and where you can learn from each other and try and influence government in terms of the shaping of policy as opposed to carrying out a project. Here are the contact points for the European Territorial Cooperation Programmes. They're based within the regional assemblies, and I don't have time to go through them all, but you'll have the details there. And just to say, that was the fastest run through. Loads of other EU programmes. If you've got questions, we're happy to take them. And just a few conclusions. It is a complex environment. You need to be able to show added value and link to the regional, national and European priorities. Applying for the funding takes time and commitment and resources, but then when you get the funding, it also takes time, commitment and resources. And there are many factors beyond your control. The amount of funding available, the geography of the programme area, the nature of the calls, the competitive nature of the programmes. You need to understand the EU policy arena to understand the funding arena. And participation has many benefits. It raises your profile, showcases your work on a European stage and leads to lots and lots of further engagements. And just to say that there's support and help at hand. Regional assemblies and the Irish Region's European Office have significant expertise, and we're really here to help you understand this complex environment. And before I get murdered for being really, really over time, just to say that's our website with our newsletter, and we've just added new funding guides and a new toolkit for EU funding to help you navigate your way through this. So have a click on our website and sign up to our newsletter, which you can do here with using this subscribe button. So thank you very much, and very happy to take your questions.
Thanks, Teresa. I knew it was always going to be a big challenge to try and get through it all so quick, but the truth of it is, it's only a taster of what's there. And I think people get a sense of your depth and range of knowledge in the area. You did say something about it'd take a whole evening, so we might take you up on that offer at some stage to actually just go in detail through each of the projects and where the funding can come from. And certainly, if there's interest in that, we will. The other thing I'd say to you is, one point you said about focusing on the projects. And I think you can see all the different schemes and get swamped down with the schemes. But if you focus on what you want to do first, then I know you would have always said in the past, work out what you want to do and we'll find the scheme to do it. And I think that's the outcome people need to have. And listen, thanks again. We'll come back to you on the questions. Just remind everyone, stick your questions into the chat. Next up, we have Alan McAdam. Alan has been working in community development as well for many, many years. I know he was the manager of a leader company in a previous lifetime many years ago. But in particular, he's excellent. And a number of people are in the field that Alan is in. And that's working with community groups about developing a plan, working out what you actually want to do in your community, and then working out where the funding can be got for that. And also helping maybe with writing application plans. And I think people need to maybe listen to Alan's story and recognise the role that people like Alan have. And other people like him. He's not the only one. There's plenty of them out there who can work with you in your community about identifying what the needs are, identifying how you go about getting the funding, and making the best possible application. So over to you, Alan, because I know you can, as I said about Teresa, you can do it a damn sight better than I can. So I'll leave it to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Colm, Minister, and ladies and gentlemen. Delighted to be able to have the opportunity to share with you this evening. So for a few short minutes, I've been asked to be brief. So for the next 5 to 7 minutes, I have a short presentation which will give you, I suppose, a flavour of key considerations to making funding applications. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen. You can let me know. Can everybody see that okay?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so okay. So as Colm outlined, I'm working, I suppose, almost 25 years in local development, former manager of a leader company, and over the last 15 years, I have worked in the private sector, working for government departments, state bodies. I've been accused of being gamekeeper turned poacher. I used to process grant applications and administer grants, and now I assist other people to secure them. I also do work under a number of the schemes the Minister mentioned, town and village renewal, etc., where I would appraise on behalf of government departments and other public bodies. I would be contracted to do appraisals, in other words, assess the applications and decide which ones warrant funding. So I suppose in terms of funding and support, why do you require funding in a group? It's basically carry out the functions of a group. It's to support, not to replace voluntary effort. And ultimately, any community organisation wants in some way or other to improve the quality of life in the area in which they live, or the region in which they live. And those are the core reasons why you would want to bring in resources. In terms of funding, there's 3 categories of sources of funding. One is obviously self-generated. You fundraise door-to-door or raffles or various different fundraising activities, and that's very challenging. It has been very challenging over the last couple of years, particularly with COVID. You've state public bodies, which I'm going to, I suppose, speak about primarily. And then the third area is charitable trusts or charities. And there aren't a large number of those in Ireland. If you go into Northern Ireland or across the water, England, Scotland, and Wales, there are large numbers of those, but there are more and more of them starting to appear here. It just isn't culturally or hasn't culturally been part of the funding schemes in Ireland. So in terms of the levels of actual aid that are available in Ireland, really, they vary depending from scheme to scheme. For most community groups that apply for funding, the levels of aid will vary between 50 and 100%. And the match funding, which is the funding you have to contribute, the number of terms used in this business, in this industry, which can sometimes be confusing. But match funding is one of them. So the match funding is the bit you have to put in. So if the funding scheme you apply to is 75%, the match funding is 25%. So that's the allocation of the amount you have to contribute, which has to come from fundraising, savings, etc. And in some exceptional cases can come from another funding body.
Sorry, just can you move your slides along? We're still on the first slide, just in case.
Sorry, is it moving for you? No?
No, it's still on the first slide. Now you're moving.
Let's just try and change. I'll stop share and share again. Okay. Can you see that one, Colm? Level of funding?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. We're moving now, yeah?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Good. So in terms of funding applications, there are 5 main categories that you would divide funding into. So number 1 is, I suppose, running our program costs, activities, which would also include staffing. The second category would be the whole area of training and various different types of events. Third area, marketing, not so much, I suppose, important for community groups, but in terms of social enterprises and community enterprise projects, marketing and social enterprise businesses, it is important. The fourth one is the whole area of research. It's known in the trade as, I suppose, analysis and development, but research, so that's your studies, your plans, your needs analysis, your feasibilities, and basically the justification of, I suppose, other types of projects, such as capital. And then the fifth one, which is the one that I suppose is most commonly known and is of most interest to community organisations, is capital funding, okay? And capital really relates to buildings, relates to equipment, relates to something physical that you can touch or feel, and most funding schemes that are out there at the moment relate to capital funding, okay? The slides moving along, okay, Colm, yeah?
Yeah, all's good.
Yeah, okay. So I suppose first thing is you need to establish if the grant scheme is for you or what grant scheme, and there are a multiplicity of schemes, some mentioned by Minister earlier, and there are quite a number of others. So it's number one, you have to identify is your organisation eligible. For example, an organisation may have had to be in existence for a number of years. It may have to maybe be a company, a community company, tax clearance, and there are various other requirements. So identify, I suppose, what are the key requirements and are you eligible? If you're not, can you become eligible by making certain changes? I suppose, is your project then eligible? Is it a good fit for the scheme? So there's no point applying to a capital scheme for running costs or for a training course if it doesn't fit. So again, these are in the scheme criteria. Can you meet the match funding requirement? This comes up a lot with sports capital applications we do, where sports capital maybe will only provide a relatively small percentage of the funding required for a capital project. Possibly project costs a couple $100,000. The maximum grant you can get from sports capital possibly is 50,000. Can you come up with the other 150 required to lever that funding? Particularly important with LEADER and other similar schemes, there's a match funding requirement. Next thing is, do you have the necessary skill, time to prepare a credible application? The scheme opens and there's usually a period of time to make an application. Do you have time or have you only found out about something it closes in 2 or 3 days? If you're not going to make a credible application, the best thing is to not, because you're only going to, I suppose, potentially tarnish the reputation of your group in terms of having an application rejected because it's substandard. So again, these are key considerations. I suppose resources to keep yourselves up to date in terms of funding calls. And one of the key things is groups find out about funding available when it's too late, the week of the application or a very short period of time. And two that I suppose groups use quite regularly are PPNs, public participation networks. They exist in every single county. They operate under the auspices of the local authority. They're an independent entity. And they basically, if you register with the PPN, it's like a community network for a given council area. They provide you free of charge with information on funding calls that come out, and it is a good way of finding out. Another one is The Wheel. It's a national charity, but they have got a subscription service. Don't know the exact cost of it. It's not very expensive, but The Wheel have got a website called Funding Point, and if you register and subscribe to that, you get emails and you get access to, I suppose, up-to-date information on funding that is available. There's also local development companies and other sources, but they're a couple to consider. I suppose next thing really is, in terms of preparing to make your funding application, you need a suitable conduit. Start at the bottom right-hand corner. As a minimum for a community group, you need a constituted group, or I suppose more commonly known in the past as an ad hoc group. And that basically is a group with a constitution. They're not basically a company or a partnership or a cooperative, but they are the minimum requirement. Some funders require a company, and if it is a community company, it's going to be a CLG company. So CLG company stands for Company Limited by Guarantee, and a number of groups have established those to, I suppose, have a suitable conduit or vehicle to apply for funding. It is no share capital. It has a number of rules I'll not go into, but basically it is the most common entity used by community groups, particularly for larger applications. You then need to have a tax reference number, tax clearance certificate. Charity number is not, there are two different types of charity number. There's a revenue charity number, there's a charity regulator one. A charity regulator charity number is mandatory now. It's the law of the land. You have to have one of those. And the vast majority of funders, if not all, will require a charity number for your group before they will fund you. The revenue charity number is a different thing, and I'm not going to that here today. It's not mandatory. So any grant over 10,000, you need tax clearance. Next thing, I suppose, is in terms of identifying need, and then the cost of the project in terms of procurement, or procurement basically is finding out the cost and identifying suppliers. That's quotations. In terms of identification of need, there are a number of key steps that need to be carried out to do that. I think I have them on the next slide. You then need a plan to implement your project. So in terms of, it's a capital project, there's probably planning permission and various other different permissions required, and you need to do them in sequence. Number 7, you need to put in place your match and your bridging finance. Match finance, mentioned a few minutes ago, is the bit you need to generate yourself to match the grant, to lever the grant. Bridging finance, most grants are retrospective. That means they pay the grant after you've paid the money out. So you need a term loan or some sort of bridging short-term overdraft facility in order to pay for the project prior to the grant basically being paid into your account. Of course, with all funding, don't spend any money until you have a letter of offer from a grant-giving agency. You spend money before the grant-giving agency has allocated money and confirmed they're going to allocate money to you. Your expenditure is usually ineligible. And in a lot of cases, finally, if you have a large committee in particular, establish a subcommittee, small number of people. Dealing with grants, if you have a 12 or 15 person committee, very, very difficult to reach agreement. Okay, a couple of, I suppose, key things in terms of identification of need. My opinion, and we write funding applications to the tune of between 30 and 40, I suppose between 30 and 40 million a year of funding applications over the last 3 years. And we would have levered funding for public bodies, for community groups, and for private business. And the same basic key things are used, particularly with community projects. Different funders have different peculiarities and requirements and different processes, but you're basically building a business case. And I suppose the 4 pillars, number 1, make sure the funding scheme or call, the rules, that they're there and the priorities that are there. You are basically meeting them with what you want to apply for. You have some sort of consultation or with local residents, community organisations, other stakeholders with a community project. 3rd pillar is use whatever other information is there available. So you need an extension community centre, if your population has doubled in the last 5 years, obviously the statistics will tell that, and that is great evidence for a funder to consider. And then, so the CSO, Central Statistics Office, they are available free of charge. On a website, you need to obviously extract them and analyse them. And then Pubble provides certain statistics as well in terms of deprivation scores, which can be used too. And then finally, congruence with government agencies and plans. What does congruence mean? Congruence basically means that you are assisting the government, whether it's our Rural Future, the National Rural Development Policy Minister mentioned earlier, or Local Economic and Community Plan, or a sports plan, or whatever the case may be, that what you are planning to do is basically helping government and agencies to basically achieve what their objectives are in the region. Colm, I'm not going to go through these because of time. I'll just go through the capital one, but these slides can be shared with people afterwards. So these are just, I suppose, some key things. And I'm thinking of basically a capital project, and a lot of our projects are community centre, extensions, renovations, walking routes, etc., playgrounds. So identify need, and again, you do your consultation or the various different, I suppose, things I mentioned there. You need title to the property. So you either need to own the property, so that the applicant needs to own the property, or they need to have a lease, and there's a minimum term basically of the lease. And if it is a lease property, you need permission from the owner to actually carry out the works that you are talking about or proposing. You need planning permission, or you need exemption. If it's exemption, it has to be given by the local authority, by the planning office, not by an architect or engineer. If they say it's exempt, it doesn't carry weight. It has to come from the planning office. You need plans or sketches. You need specification and list of the works. The key thing as well in the times you were in, identify and be sure you can get insurance. Dealt with a group today, not too far away from us here in Monaghan, and an issue for them with the community centre was there was an old building they were taking on. They were going to have to make considerable modifications to it to get a fire certificate. Without a fire certificate, they cannot get insurance. So insurance is something I always would suggest people check out. Can you get insurance for the project if you go ahead with it? Other permissions, for example, if it's an old courthouse or some building that's listed, there may need to be additional permissions required. So it's key. Other things that funders will be looking for is that if they fund this project, that it will actually continue to operate and run after the money has been provided. So a plan for use, how it's going to be maintained and basically used. And then one of the final things, obviously, that you have tax compliance, you have tax clearance, access certificate, and the same applies to any contractor you may actually work with. So look, Colm, I'm going to leave it at that, and I think the presentation probably can be shared with people afterwards, because there are a few other slides there that I'm not going to dwell on.
Listen, thanks very much, Alan, for that. Certainly we'd be delighted to share the slides, and I think all the slides hopefully will be available from the various speakers, and I think there's plenty of information in them, so certainly we'll do that. Also, just to let you know, we've developed a funding guide in conjunction with some of the speakers here indeed, and I think we'll circulate that hopefully to people as well in due course as well. But I want to go over to our last speaker, Enda McGloin. Enda McGloin has worked in Drumshanbo in County Leitrim for many years. He's chairman of the local community development council, and he has worked with that community development council for 10 years. And I suppose, in fairness, I think Enda will just be able to show us some of what can be achieved if a community works together, comes up with a plan, and then works to deliver it, find the funding and works to deliver it. So I'll pass over to you, Enda. I don't wish to put pressure on you. We've approximately half an hour left. There's plenty of questions coming in, so if we can make sure we've enough time for questions as well. Thanks, Enda.
Okay, Colm, I'm on a timer, so I'm going to keep to my allotted time. Just to say to you this, I suppose, as you say, I'm from Drumshanbo, I'm a councillor there as well. And I suppose this is basically part of our story, just to tell you where we came from in terms of the various developments that we were involved in over the years. So we have a local committee made up of the usual, a lot of us are there for a long time. I suppose the difficulty now is getting new people, but we basically were founded in 1989. We had the closure of the Laird's Jam Factory, the ESB power station, the Rigna Mines, and that had a massive impact on the town. So the community then looked at acting. We had huge job losses, and I suppose at the end of the day, we had the Arigna power station that had closed, the Arigna mines had closed, and then we had, for example, a scenario here like the old Laird's factory that was in the middle of the town. So this was a development that we undertook at a very early stage. We built a new house called Laird House, which was involved childcare centre and offices, and it was officially opened then in 2007. And then we again developed it again in terms of, you can see it there, that was the new format of it. This was Bo Peep Kids, Childhood Days, Leitrim Childcare Development. So basically it was headquartered as well, Leitrim Warmer Homes. Just there recently under Town and Villages, under the COVID scheme, you see we've done a little bit of a development in front of it. Again, a project that the Community Council got involved in and initiated. Now, in terms of the town itself, we had, for example, in the middle of the town, we had the old mart, and then we looked at that and trying to free up traffic, try and get more business into the town. And you can see there, again, this is what happened. We developed the road in conjunction with
I'm not sure if I've been to the slides. Are you sharing slides?
Yeah, can you, oh, sorry, just a second. Bear with me for a moment. My apologies.
You're grand. It's just the pictures painted.
Yeah, sorry, I presumed I had been sharing there. Sorry, when's this one moment now? Yeah, so look, I'll go through again. It's just, as I was saying, these are all parts like the Arigna power station, the Arigna mines, and I said this is a lot of town development we're involved in. Laird House, then we had here the redevelopment of that, which was in the old factory site of Laird's, and this is again town development there in front of Laird House, and this was at the site of the mart, and we developed it into free up a lot of the traffic. It was causing huge problems, and we developed this into what it is now to give easy access around our town. I suppose if we didn't get involved in this, the council would find it difficult to negotiate with the mart, and that proved successful. You can see the further development of the road. You see there myself and Minister Humphreys and local TD Frank Feehan, and we got funding of another 130,000, again the community driven, to try and clean up that side of the road and do some work on it and to deal with eyesores. So the town itself as a town, it's always important to remember that you know, people who come to the town are observing it and make an attractive place for people to come and stay. And this was a further development we had. We took on a old piece of ground beside the school, developed that. Again, we got some peace funding for that, and laterally leader funding. Again, an old schoolhouse in front of the Church of Ireland needed development. We did some work on that and converted it as well. We were involved in a little thing called Leitrim Calling Service that calls hundreds of older people who live in the community a twice weekly call, and that's another service administered by our local community council. We have a community employment scheme that deals with a lot of issues around it. We have over 18 people working on that. Here's a picture going back to 1981. The old Laird's Jam Factory, then Minister for Industry and Commerce John Bruton opened it in 1981, and that was the product was Bo Peep Jam. But unfortunately, in 1990, it closed with the loss of a significant number of jobs. But back late in 2003, we decided to redevelop that into the food hub. So you can see the factory being gutted out here, major redevelopment of it into 7 or 8 different food incubation units. That we come up with the concept of this food hub. So a food hub is one whereby people who, for example, were involved in development of food problems had difficulties in terms of the capital costs of putting together a place where they would manufacture the food. So we looked at this as an issue and got people in at reduced I suppose cost in terms of rent. So it made it feasible then to start up their food business. So at the time, we were assisted by the International Fund for Ireland, Leitrim Development Company under Leader, Enterprise Ireland, and again, the Arigna Leader Company. So we had feasibility studies developing the model. We secured a 99-year lease, secured 1.8 million to realise a 26,000 square foot tenant production facility, I should say. So opened in 2007, we had huge difficulties at the beginning actually getting clients in. So it manufactured itself to be officially opened in 2007 by the then minister, and we got numerous awards over the years into 2014 Ulster Bank Awards. But effectively, I suppose this is where we are today. We struggled in the early time, but we have a company called Chef in the Box, McNiff's Bakery, which is involved in the manufacture of Boxleys, a local produce that many people will be aware of. The Cheese Hub, the Shed Distillery is one of the most well-known distilleries, and in terms of Drumshanbo, Gunpowder Inn, and another company called Nua Bakehouse. So as without going through it again, we also have a community kitchen that's involved in training and hospitality training, and we put through an awful lot of students through the ETB and Leitrim Development Company. There's just some of the products coming out of the food hub today that's very successful. You can see here the Drumshanbo Gunpowder Gin and the distillery and the various other products there in food hampers that's produced locally. That's one of our EU funders that we used along the line. And again, you can see we got over 200,000 in REDS funding that was used to develop an exhibition area for food. And during that time also we got 200,000 in town and village scheme, and also 150,000 in leader funding for the various efforts. And I suppose the big development the last couple of years was the Shed Distillery, Drumshanbo Whiskey, the Drumshanbo Gunpowder Gin, and then the opening of the Visitor Centre, which is a model used in Scotland for a lot of the distilleries where they have visitor centres attached. And you can see there was the concept, and then it developed itself. You can see where it's developed there now, bringing private investment. That's the shop as part of it. You were there yourself, Colm, and that's just the entrance. So that gives you an idea. So as we are right now, we're looking at, we have 120 jobs in the food hub, layered house that you saw earlier, 45 of the community scheme. So about 183, which is a significant boost to the local economy here in Drumshanbo. Briefly, I'm looking at the clock and I'm a little bit over, but I'll keep going. That's the Blue Wave that was developed by Waterways Ireland, and again it's a fantastic tourism development that's bringing a huge amount of people onto the boardwalk. It's walked by a lot of people. It was opened in 2017 and it's now further being developed right up as far as Leitrim Village to Carrigan Shannon back to Ballinamore. I just mentioned the credit union there as something that a lot of we've used over the years to assist us, and I think possibly it could be used more by communities. This is another development recent times. It's called the Food Hub 2. It's under Leitrim Food Enterprise Zone, a sister company from Drumshanbo Community Council. We got 950,000 to buy an old Mattel Advance factory, which was built in 1981. The community now have acquired it, and effectively we have hoping to have in the region of 50 jobs. We're still short a few pounds, but we're working on that. And I think it's great to see a factory closed since 2002, the bottom of the town, now being started, and hopefully with over 50 jobs on the way. This is another plan that we have with the old Bank of Ireland, just recently closed in October. We're hoping to put forward development there under one of the newest town development there, you can see that whole square area, hopefully to develop that into a working rural hub there in the centre of the town. So that's going to come under consideration shortly. Our challenges we have, there's our local hotel, which unfortunately is closed. We're hoping to get that, should be open in the new year, hopefully, and then we've no petrol. These are some of the challenges. So look at, I know I'm a bit fast, but I'm just trying to give an overall perspective of, I suppose, where we were back in the 1990s and where we are today, and the work that we've been doing, assisted greatly, I have to say, by the Department of Community Rural Development under Minister Humphreys, and previous to that Minister Ring. And I suppose Leader as well was a significant player in terms of facilitating us with our developments over the years. Sorry for I went over.
No, you're grand. You're grand. Okay. Maybe to touch from everybody's perspective, and maybe to start with where Enda's overview there. Like when you see what was achieved from Drumshanbo over, let's say, 20 years, like the jobs in the Enterprise Centre, the Gunpowder Gin, obviously a massive success, but even the Chef in a Box type scenario. Like, what are the key ingredients for community? I'll start with you and then maybe come to you, Alan, as well on this. What's the key ingredients for community? Obviously, for anyone starting off, that seems a million miles away from where they are now. But what's the first steps that people need to take to get themselves on that road to being able to achieve all these things? Like for one small community to achieve all that is enormous. But I suppose where to start.
You mentioned earlier there about town and villages and new ideas and not footpaths, and I suppose when you're presented with a problem, you then have to deal with it. And in our case, we had the Layers factory was closed, or at least it was owned by Food Industries, and they decided to sell it, and a developer bought it. So like we could either sit back and just forget about it, or say, well, what can we do with that? And we were lucky enough that there was a man by the name of Noel McPartland, who was a former sales manager, was engrossed in the whole food industry. He knew of people who wanted to start new food industries, but had the difficulty of trying to get the capital to be able to set up something in a local enterprise centre, or even build something themselves. So he knew that was an obstacle. He went to the funders and said, you know, there's an awful lot of people who really want to get going in food industry, and, you know, need a starting point, they need the location, they need a base. So ours turns into be an enterprise centre, but for food producers. So I think to answer your question is, where you have a problem, where you have an issue, where you see something that needs to be done, I suppose you have to think outside the box in terms of an idea. And I think in that case, in the relation to the food up, we thought outside the box and knew this was something that needed to happen. And I think in that sense, we spotted a market and we went for it. Now, we were very lucky at the beginning because the bank was up against us. We were only 1/3 occupancy, and we were, you know, basically struggling. And then we just kept at it and at it and at it. And then we were lucky to meet Pat Rigney of Peter Rigney and the distillery, and a number of other people who basically came in as tenants, and I suppose saved us in many respects. But I suppose if we didn't take that plunge at the very beginning and take our chances, we would never have attracted the type of jobs. There was less than 100 people working in Layers when they closed in 1990, and now we've nearly doubled that. And that's based on
Have you any particular perspective in terms of where communities need to start to pull something together like Drumshanbo? It's obviously an extreme example of what can be achieved, but for many, it's just the baby steps they want to start with.
Yeah, look, I think the key ingredient for me is basically a small group of dedicated people who have the best interests of their community and set aside self-interest on occasion, because being a volunteer, putting your shoulder to the wheel on many of these projects on occasion, and we've all been there, can sometimes not be as we expected or as we planned, and it doesn't always work out. But I suppose key group of dedicated people who are willing to work together and put their shoulder to the wheel. And second thing is, get good advice from local development company, council, whoever, and basically put in place at an early stage an appropriate structure, and secondly, an appropriate plan of action. And I suppose the key thing, you know, really is for people to stay with a group and continue to give of their time to voluntary capacity. People need to see progress, and consult with and bring your community with you. I've seen on a number of occasions where you have small groups go ahead with very good ideas and very good projects, but maybe the consultation with the broader community has not been as good as it could be, and that can lead to issues as well. So look, key group of dedicated people, plan. Old saying, measure twice and cut once.
Teresa, have you gotten to throw in that one in terms of where people need to start from?
Yeah, I think I'd agree with both Enda and Alan in their points, but I also think, you know, and I've done lots of work in the past with community groups and maybe smaller organisations. You need the volunteers, the people to work, to drive it, but you also need a really good governance system. And I think Alan made the point that you have to be able to spend the money first and claim it back later. And that's true for most schemes, probably nationally and at European level. You're spending up front and you're claiming it back. So you need a robust governance system that, you know, clear committees, clear path, clear lines of how you're running the organisation. But also you need then, as I would always say to an organisation when they approach me, how liquid are you? Do you have reserves? Do you have money in the bank? Do you have something so that if you spend the money, and if it's an EU programme, you're spending the money and then you're claiming it back, and you're only getting it back if your financial verification of expenditure is done correctly. So it's about having governance in place and processes in place that allow you to do that effectively.
Thanks for that. Now, there's a lot of questions in the chat, and I suppose a number of them, just to say, are in relation to specific questions in relation to particular funding schemes. And probably, I think what the best thing on some of them is we may go back to people individually and get answers to them. Some of them are probably geared towards the minister who has left. But I'll try and pick up on some of the general ones for a start. In relation to planning permission, there's just one here from Michael Tobin about a project on Clare Island in relation to pods and upgrading to upgrade their hub. And he wants to know if they don't have planning permission, will they not get funding, basically? So I think you touched on that earlier, Alan. Do you want to make a quick comment on that?
If it's a fixed structure, usually planning is required. There are a few exemptions to it. They need one of two things. They need a letter on headed paper from their local council, planning authority, confirming they don't need planning, or else they need planning. Now, in relation to mobile equipment and machinery, you don't need planning for it, obviously, but pods are more a fixed structure that basically are fixed down to the ground. I've done applications for a number of them, and every one of them that I've done, I haven't done that many, done maybe 7 or 8 applications over the last few years. Pods are a relatively new number, glamping pods, a new term to us all, but every single one of them needed planning permission, but none of them didn't. So my advice would be get a local architect or engineer or somebody who has some knowledge of the local planners and organise a pre-planning meeting, a consultation with the planning office to check if planning is required. And that's a meeting, there's no charge to have a pre-planning meeting other than if you have to employ someone to sit in it with you and have details of the site and the type of pods, have it available, have a bit of preparation done in advance, check it out. Can't get exemption, planning permission, I would suggest, would be required.
Another question here from George O'Connor. I don't know who wants to take it. But sustainable communities to assist in environmental initiatives, will there be funding for them, or where do they go for funding for sustainable communities? Given that I suppose the drive towards our environmental ambition at the moment and the Green Deal. So where should they go for that?
Yeah, Colm, I can maybe start on taking that. I think the Minister mentioned it earlier. Nearly all of these government programmes are going to be underpinned by the Green Deal, and those that Teresa mentioned as well are all underpinned by the Green Deal. And if you look at the current round even of LEADER, which is kind of the stable diet core rural development programme we've had for many years, there obviously are environmental measures under the current transitional programme, which is a 2-year programme for 2021, from April 21 to December 22. I know there's a number of leader people on this call, but basically they have got a particular focus, and they've been asked by the department to focus specifically on environmental type projects aside from digitisation economy and other things as well. The next round of rural development supports that are coming are going to focus heavily on that. We haven't got the minutiae of detail, as Teresa mentioned earlier, of all of these schemes, but it is anticipated and it has been flagged that there will be considerable emphasis on the environment, whether that's ecology, whether it's renewable energy, whether it's alternative fuels, whether it's green businesses or whatever, whether it's training, upskilling, capacity building, all of those, there will be resources, particularly I know under the new Leader Rural Development Programme, and the budget for that was indicated there in recent weeks.
Teresa, from a European perspective?
Yeah, I think I agree with Alan. Sustainable communities is a theme that will run through all of the funding programs. I suppose what I would ask the person who asked the question is, in terms of sustainable communities, do you have an idea specifically within that you want to do? And I would unpick that a little bit more. You know, what is the project? What does it want to do? What does it want to achieve? So, you know, the overall objective will be a sustainable community, but within that, there'll have to be a number of strands that you want to achieve. So I would say, think about your overall objective is to build a sustainable community in whatever part of the country you're in. then think about what are the 3 or 4 things you want to do. Is it about building, a remote working hub? Is it about maybe doing some environmental improvements to some of the buildings? Is it about, creating a social hub for older people or young people or whatever? So I'd say think of what the actual objectives underneath that are, and then that will help to identify the funding programme in a little bit more detail. And the Minister and Alan and Enda have talked very much about the national programmes and what's there in terms of the rural development schemes. In terms of the EU programmes I covered, certainly the one around the Northern Periphery and Arctic is one, depending on where you're geographically based within the country, depends on whether in Ireland, depends on whether you're eligible for it or not, but it would certainly be one. And it's a small enough one. As I said, I like it because it's a good starter one if you want to get into the world of transnational interreg programs, and it allows you to build partnerships and capacity with other rural communities as well. So I would say chiefly break down what sustainable communities is for you, and then we take it from there in terms of the relevant funding.
There's plenty of questions, so I'll try and get through some of them fairly quickly. Slovak has asked, he's part of the Polish community in the Midlands, and they're trying to establish a Midlands community TV station. So I don't know, it's a CLG, company limited by guarantee. Any ideas where you might get funding for a community-based TV station? Sounds like an interesting one.
I actually give an answer in the chat column, but the first port of call in terms of maybe a study to justify the need or the feasibility or viability of it. I would go to leader. I hope the leader people on the call don't get annoyed with me by saying that, but I think that would be the first port of call. Go to them. If it's across a number of counties, there is a special dedicated budget at a national level for cooperation projects between leader areas. So, for example, if there are 3 or 4 counties, they can actually apply to a central fund for a cooperation budget that's over and above their own dedicated budget, and maybe that's a first. In terms of running a community TV, I know in some cases I've seen the equipment, in other words, the broadcasting equipment, etc., the microphones, they've got funding from various different sources. A community enhancement scheme. Some have gone through Leader as well. The running costs, they're not going to get them from anybody as such that I'm aware of, but they could maybe get some staff or maybe apprentices or whatever through some of the schemes, maybe to help out, not necessarily be presenters, but through maybe rural social scheme, etc. But presenters, etc., you're really talking about either volunteers or maybe students you could link with, maybe colleges in terms of media studies and media skills, and they could get assistance through those as well.
But a critical point about it is that, if you like, they'll get money for the capital investment, and they may get funding in terms of staffing, in terms of CE schemes or TUS or whatever. But the actual running cost is the challenge. So when you're taking up something, make sure you have a plan for it. Teresa, I don't know if you'd want to come in on that or not.
Just very briefly, I'm going to say I'm sounding like the bad cop here, but I would ask another question. What's the purpose of the radio station, and how is that contributing to the local community? Now, there'll be really, really good reasons as to what that is going to do, and it's integrating the community and integrating maybe the Polish community and the local community. And then I would say there are programs that look at integrating new communities within more established communities. You might look at some of the EU funds around citizenship and Citizens for All, or whatever it's now called. There may also be, again, some of the Atlantic area, Northern Periphery, about building socially inclusive communities. And that might be a means to do that. But I would say, what's the end goal of the community radio station?
I think that's very same of anything. I think you need to work out what you want to do and why you want to do it first, and then we're going to get the funding. Just in relation to a different question that's come in from, I hope I have the name right here, Tully Rantala from Inishbofin Island. And it's a very, very important question, I think. Is there a yearly calendar for funding streams? She makes the point that it's a 6-month application process for many, and you need to know in advance when the dates are coming. So is there anywhere you can go to where you can get a kind of a schedule or a calendar of when the closing dates and when the deadlines are for different schemes?
That's a very difficult one, particularly at the moment, as when I started my presentation, said on the EU side, a lot of the programs are just being developed. So there definitely won't be a funding calendar yet. And I did say in my presentation, there's no set calendar. By being in contact with the national contact points, which you've got on my slides, they will be, as the programs are agreed, be able to indicate when calls might come. I know, because I asked the other day the same question, the Northern Periphery and Arctic program has a call out at the moment, which is a bridging call to bridge between the two programming periods. It will probably open its first call of the new funding period in Q2 of 2022, and the Atlantic Area Programme is not foreseen to have a funding call before Q3 of 2022. So it's just about keeping in contact. Look at the websites that I've given you on the slides. They will start to publish them as the programmes get approved, but we're at a time where we're just kind of in a bit of flux between the programming periods.
I don't know further the other two. One thing I would say in relation to it is in relation to the PPNs. I know certainly in my local PPN in Louth, they issue a weekly communique where they highlight all the different funding opportunities that are coming and the calls and the dates for them. So staying in touch with your PPN can be a good route to knowing when the different calls are. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on that.
Just briefly, Colm, I suppose the local authorities now have a very good economic development unit within most of them, and there's usually a lead person or persons in that unit that will liaise directly with the communities. Certainly in terms of the timescale, most of those funding is coming from particularly Heather's department, Community and Rural Development, and they, over the course of a year, there's various calls under headings that's usually signalled by the department. And then I suppose what's the easiest thing for communities is to liaise directly with that person in the local authority and describe, if they were able to describe their project or what they want to do, then as the period goes on, that the person in the local authority will be able to go back to them and say, look, maybe through Clore, maybe through Town and Village, I think this is a scheme that would best suit your community. And I think to me, that's always a good start. I don't know, maybe Alan might have further to add on that.
Yeah, look, and I agree completely. One thing I would say is, I think the Minister at the beginning mentioned about some new schemes and even the questions about rural regeneration. There isn't even a set date for when the next round is to open, although it will be before the end of the year. But the fact of the matter is, don't wait for schemes to open. There is no calendar. There never has been. That's the environment we live in. We have an idea it's going to happen within a 6-month period or whatever. But the problem for people is capital projects. And capital projects get your title sorted, get your planning permission in place, get your specifications done, get your cost estimates, and be ready to go to tender. And have those things done. And a 6-week opening period or an 8-week opening period or 2 months or whatever will not be a problem for you. And do your community consultations and your business case or your study or whatever to justify the project, whether that's a playground, walkway, community centre, digital hub, whatever it is. Do your work in advance. Don't wait for the fund to open. We know there are going to be funds available. If it's not this one, it'll be another one. Another thing is, if you look at it, we've been involved in plans and strategies and village and town plans, and basically the one document has in some cases lasted for 5 years to justify a multiplicity of different applications. The only thing that will change is basically the statistics. And we haven't had a census since 2016. Basically, the CSO statistics change, supposedly change every 5 years. It's a wee bit longer now because of COVID, we didn't have our census. So they're the things, the demographic figures will change. But the other stuff, if you do it, as long as it's reasonably current, in other words, within the last couple of years, it will be used. Tendering, just the final thing, Colm, on tendering does go out of date. So if you go to tender and get quotes and do procurement too early, you basically, the quotes basically die. Some funders, it's 3 months, others it's 6 months. So if you get a quote and it has a date on it and it's more than 6 months old, you will have to go and do it again. So that's the only bit I would say, maybe wait until you know the funding call is there. But do your preparatory work in advance. Do not wait. And those that are most successful at securing funding have prepared well in advance, not waited for the fund to open.
I think that's that, but I think that's critical to the whole thing. I think number one, to get a plan in place, know what you want in your community, identify the things you want to do, get all your plannings and things ready, and then, as I say, have it shovel ready. And I think the point you make, Alan, as regards, okay, hold the procurement element back, but have everything else, have your planning permission, have all your other ducks in a row. There will be multiple funding schemes coming down the track. If you're ready, then when the window opens, you'll be the one fit. So often it happens with these schemes, they're looking for somebody to fund because the window is relatively short. If you're ready to go, then you'll be one to be able to take advantage of that. And that's probably the most significant. I don't know, do you want to come in on that?
Just a very small point. I think the other issue is match funding. You know, it's usually a lot of those are funded at between 70 and 90%. And then you have to find the 20 or 10%. And that's an important thing that communities need to have at the ready. The other point, and I just talked there briefly during my presentation, we got an REDF funding of 950,000, and we're in the process now of, as you can see, developing that second food hub. But you must remember, bridge funding is important. To have an arrangement either with a bank or a lending institution, because when you get the bills, you have to pay them. You then have to send that directly into the funder, and then the funder pays. So in other words, there's a gap between paying everybody and be able to recollect the money. So you must have bridge funding in place alongside the match funding.
That's great. There's multiple questions here for different specific funding areas. Maybe one, actually, Alan, you'd be familiar with is the LEADER programme. Embed remote employment into the new LEADER strategy. That's what Seamus Bonner from Aaron Moore is asking in relation to if there's going to be a new LEADER rural development programme as part of the plan. Will a remote working and remote employment be a central part of that, or how do people go about making that happen? Maybe.
Yeah, look, Colm, it's already a key part of the transitional programme. When I say transitional programme, LEADER comes usually in 5-year cycles or so. The last cycle ended last year, so there's a gap usually of 1 or 2 years, but for the first time, I suppose, a gap programme has been basically announced by the minister. I can't remember the exact budget. I think the figure of 70 million or something came into my head, but basically there's an allocation of money is available over a couple of years, and basically one of the core focuses of that is digitization of the rural economy. So digitization of the rural economy involves adoption of rural businesses and communities to utilize the newly found broadband connections that are appearing all over the place, and the broadband connection points for, I suppose, the betterment of their areas, improving quality of life. So it's already happening. It's going to feature strongly in the next LEADER programme. The next LEADER programme at this moment in time, and I know there's Martine Early and a number of others on the call who would be better informed, but the fact of the matter is the next LEADER programme the planning process is due to kick off early in the new year, and we would anticipate or hope that there will be a new programme basically approved around the country. I think there's a budget of circa 180 million. It's a bit of a drop from what was there in the past, but maybe that will increase with time. So it already is there. The other big fund, which other two funds that are funding digital hubs and remote working hubs, our RRDF, Rural Regeneration Development Fund, 90% grant. Local authority or public body applies in cooperation with local community groups. And there's funding there being allocated between 500,000 and 5-6 million for a multiplicity of projects across the region. And the last one is Town and Village. Town and Village, while it has dropped footpaths and car parks, it has focused on digital hubs, remote working of a smaller scale project that aren't multi-million euro projects. So projects there between, say, 100,000 and 500,000, 90% funding available for maybe conversion of old buildings, courthouses, market houses, etc. Now we're still waiting. They're due to be announced, hopefully in the next few weeks. They haven't been announced yet. There was a call earlier this year, but it's anticipated it will open again next year. So there are 3 different avenues there. LEADER, Town and Village renewal, or rural regeneration for the very large scale ones, but they are really led by local authorities or public body. The other 2 can be led by local community groups.
Just moving on to another one, Colette Deeney here, a transport for education and social inclusion for young people in rural areas. Is there any plans for a youth local link service, is what she asked, subsidised travel cards, things like that? Is there anything specifically for young people in a rural link service?
Yeah, Alan? I actually, believe it or not, I'm working with 3 rural transport groups at the moment around the country in terms of planning, and there's a Connecting Ireland strategy, which basically has been developed by the National Transport Authority to roll out additional local link coordinated services. Now, there's obviously consultation around that in terms of prioritising where money is going. I saw in the budget there's increased money going to be available, I suppose, next year and the following few years under rural transport after quite a number of years the budget not changing. So the direct answer is there a dedicated fund or mechanism for youth? No, there isn't. But the rural transport and the local link programme is no longer the older person's bus. The rural transport programme is basically part of this local link network, which basically is to provide transport for those who need it, young or old. So basically the guidelines have broadened. How do you basically get consultation process in local areas in terms of that Connecting Ireland, participate in it, prioritise, contact your local link, and basically it all comes down to a business case and numbers being available to actually use the service. So if some research was done, possibly the local link coordinator would be a place I would go to.
Yeah, so go to your local link coordinator and make the case that there's a justified need for this for you, be it an early morning bus or a late one, and get that as part of their plan. Teresa, you're trying to come in there.
Yeah, no, I would say also, that's a really good example of wanting to achieve one thing and being creative about how you get the funding for that. So I would also then think, well, it may be a case that you just need transport to get people from A to B, but if that's wrapped around a set of youth programs or interventions that are going to assist young people, maybe looking after their mental health or looking after getting the more physical activity or whatever, you almost wrap that as one element within a wider project, and that might also help access other schemes. So not just thinking about one thing in its own right.
Yeah, absolutely. It's back to the point of, if you know what you want to do, then there's multiple ways you can approach it. And I think it's more about working out what you want first. Bridge Grealish has asked about small, it's a fair point. If you listen to what we've been talking about here, it's all about a big funding and it's all about significant projects that maybe the like of Enda has achieved. But small communities, getting matching funding in small communities, any suggestions about going about how they can do it? Is it possible to get reduced level of match funding requirement in some of the schemes, or what can people do to actually, any tricks or suggestions around raising matching funding?
Yeah, the rules have changed on a few of them already, Colm. The town and village renewal and some of those schemes, the rate of aid has gone up to 90%. It was 75 and 80%. So it's gone up to reflect the challenging environment of fundraising. I suppose aside from that, there are these things called co-financing rules. And if you've got particularly a European, an EU source of funding, there's a thing called co-financing. State aid can't go above a certain level. So you can't have two funds from government and EU sources, usually on the same invoice or the same cost. So that's it. But there are, and I know some of the PPNs recently have done some training on this to, I suppose, assist groups to be more creative around fundraising and fundraising techniques and strategies. But it is a competitive field out there, and there's no easy answer on town and village renewal. And I'll finish on this. And I'm not going to mention the councils in question. I've worked with a number of them, but some councils have used municipal district funding and topped up the community contribution. So 10% is supposed to come from the community. The municipal district has maybe paid 5 or 8% of that. And that hasn't happened in every county. So maybe there's a solution in the short term.
Teresa?
I think, yeah, as I mentioned in my presentation, certainly for the programmes that I've talked about, funding can be staff costs. So and appreciate it might be a volunteer community group, so you don't have staff costs, but if you do have any staff costs, that quite often can be used as the match funding. The other thing I would say is, again, can you partner with someone else? Can you partner with your local authority? And I know local authorities may say, we can't take the hit, tough times and all of that. But again, if they have a staff cost that they can put in as the match, might actually also help. So it's about thinking a little bit outside of the box of who else could we partner with. I don't know the size of your community association or community organisation, but the other people that are really good partners for this are universities or your further education colleges, might also be, because they're kind of in the business of accessing funding, and they quite often know how to navigate this field as well.
And
yeah, no, I suppose one of the examples I was given there in my presentation, I just done the figures this evening, and we spent 26,000 on an enhancement of a certain area, and we were looking at it afterwards. It just cost us over €1,000 because some of the labour through the rural social scheme, we were able to account for some of that as match funding. And secondly, tidy towns were involved, and some of for example, the Shed Distillery give substantially over the year to our tidy towns, because they see the presentation of the town as vital for them in terms of attracting people in. So the tidy towns was involved in that project as well, and came in with some funding with us. I think it was funded 90%, but the net result for a 26,000 investment was €1,000. So I think from that point of view, it's good value for the community. And there is the traditional ways, of course, of always fundraising, but sometimes if you think outside the box, you can reduce that burden on the community.
One last question is probably specific here to Teresa. Maybe you might know it. The Capitan Fund, CAPITEN Fund. Are you familiar with it? It's Atlantic Cluster for Technological and Economic Innovation in Nautical Sector. Sounds a bit of a mouthful. It's probably one we can get back on.
I'm not familiar with it.
Tom Fox was asking about it. Tom obviously is well up in some of these things. Outside of that, look, there's other ones here, and they're very specific around funds that didn't succeed or things like that. One general question that is just about rural development and Leader in relation to the cuts in the Leader budget. I don't know, Teresa, if you want to deal with that from a European level, or if there's anything at the European level in relation to that, and equally at a national level. I know the Minister probably would have been the one to deal with it, but she's not. But we will write to her and get an answer and come back to people on it. I don't know, Teresa, if you want to comment on that. I know
you're not following it very closely. I could look into it, but I do know there was the bridging funding for the Leader programs. But no, I would say it's probably if it's a reduction in the Leader funding from the EU level, I guess it's because the methodology used to calculate how well Ireland is doing has indicated that Ireland is doing better than it has been doing in the past. So hence that often means the reduction in funding, which is what's happened for the European Regional Development Funding. The better off you are, and all the stats they use. I mean, we could argue about that all night, I'm sure, but no, I would have to look into that.
Yeah, look, we can look into some of these. There is specific ones like that. But I think in relation to the Leader Fund, from my own knowledge, but anyway, I know the overall cap budget at European level is cut by about 2.5%, and that will factor in little as well. But my understanding is at a national level that the funding was matched from the National Exchequer. Now we can get a detail in relation to that. There was a significant cut in the previous Leader programme, but this one I think it's a relatively small cut. So look, we'll get a little bit more detail on that and circulate it to people on the basis for it.
I suppose, Colm, just briefly, the other thing that's coming down the tracks, and again, I don't know a huge amount of it, but the peace funding is something, the next round of peace isn't too far away either. I suppose we have to get the nitty gritty and the exact emphasis of funding that will be in this case. I suppose some of it will be around climate and all of that, but I don't know whether Teresa knows anything more than that, but that's something, another further stream that some communities, particularly for us like yourselves on the board, would be looking out for in terms of capital funding.
Yeah, and you did see in my presentation, there is the slide about the peace funding, and that was from their most recent public consultation. That was the proposed themes. I know they're working on finalising that to go out to another public consultation, and presume they'll want to go live with that program by the end of next year. It is a massive program. It's over €1 billion this time. So it's a combination of the Peace and the Interreg. And it's, as I said, you know, I think there'll be plenty of opportunities. It's supporting communities. It's supporting collaborations at the public sector level. It's supporting the environment. Young people, actually, there's a strand in there for young people. There's building positive relations, the local action, peace local action partnerships that local authorities will be familiar with. So all of that will be continuing or giving up new opportunities. So having worked at SEUPB in the past, I'm fairly familiar with how they operate their things, but they will be wanting to get it out on the ground ASAP, because don't forget, funding bodies have spending targets to get their money spent when they get allocated it. So it's important for them as well to get the money on the ground, as it is for the local communities to access it.
We've run about 15 minutes over time, and to be honest, there's probably about another 10 or 15 questions here. They probably, a lot of them boil down to funding applications and where to go for different funding, and equally what you do if you haven't succeeded. I don't know, I might come back to each of you just for one bit of advice for people. If you haven't succeeded this time, what's your bit of advice to people in terms of where they should go or what they should do? I'll start with you, Teresa.
If you haven't succeeded and you want to go back, what would I say? I think get someone to have a look at it. So someone, depending on the scheme, ask someone to review your application. And that could be a consultant, but you might have to pay for that. It might be somebody in the program secretariat. You should get feedback actually from most of the program secretariats as to why it wasn't funded. So you should get detailed feedback. And I would say, think about addressing every single point that is on the page and have somebody different read it when you do redo it, because I think we all get into groupthink when we're writing applications, and we all think it's brilliant, and you need someone just take a step back and go, okay, I'm gonna have someone look at it with a different perspective. But I would say take the feedback on board, read every single word and address every single part of it. That's the best.
Yeah, look, agree with what Teresa said. You know, if you're rejected or a project has been deferred or you're unsuccessful, if you're not given feedback, ask for it, you're entitled to it. If you apply to any state-funded scheme or initiative, sometimes you will get a one-liner, you have been unsuccessful, thank you very much for your interest in our programme. Ring them up, contact them and ask them for feedback. It's not going to be held against you. It might annoy a little bit the person that has to go to the bother of providing it, or in a lot of cases, they will give you a call and give it to you on the phone rather than maybe in writing, and that can be very useful. Document it and basically fill the gaps. In some cases, I find people just aren't prepared. They haven't put in the work and effort, and particularly on appraisal of schemes. We spend probably a month every year appraising applications, and some of them are just terrible and some of them are really, really good. But again, pitching. One thing is preparing for an application. If you're applying for €5,000, don't expect the same level of detail and rationale and justification is going to get you 500,000 on another form. Depending on the complexity and the amount of money, you have to put in additional effort. And I find that's a key deficiency. But get feedback and home in. Don't redo the whole thing. Home in on the bits. And the other thing is, go to people that have been successful. Speak to them. Go a little bit outside your own area where you're not a competitor. Go to a different county or whatever and speak to them, and they will give you more advice, and that's free. You don't have to pay for that.
And
well, I suppose I'd bow to Alan and Teresa's greater knowledge on some of these things, but I was going to suggest you ring your local councillor and MEP and minister and give out hell, but I don't advise that. No, on a serious note, I suppose, and Alan mentioned this earlier, and it's very, very important, and a lot of groups that start off look for an idea, they don't go down the road of the feasibility study. And as Alan said earlier, there is, like, especially through Leader, there is, and actually the local LEO office on some occasions can assist as well in terms of feasibility, and giving groups the opportunity to study their ideas and put it on paper and spend maybe even something around €5,000 in terms of investigating all of the angles of the idea and see, is it workable in terms of an application. Some groups don't even think about doing that, and a lot of them, you send them back to the drawing board to do that. And certainly I'd echo the other points that Teresa and Alan made, especially in terms of, you know, getting other people, getting an outsider to look at it. But essentially, I think a feasibility study is more than important for a lot of groups in terms of determining how they put forward their application.
But one thing that's just, I think, both yourself, both and Alan touched on it. Like, I know you've done a lot of this, Alan, in the past, in the past, inviting groups to see the work that you've done and talking it through them. Meeting a group somewhere else in the country that have been through this already is so important for people to learn from. And the other thing I would say, like, okay, getting someone, like, particularly if you're in the $500,000 grant application stage, like having someone that has a bit of professional expertise to look over your grant application, they'll put to it in a day or two what might take you a month to do, and they'll know the context in terms of policy documents and all that, the key things to reference. And getting the like of a hired gun, as I call them, on board, it might cost you a few quid, but it could be the best few quid you ever spent, because they'll also work with you in terms of what the needs in the community are, developing a strategic plan. And if you put forward applications that are based on the needs in the community, that plan that you can demonstrate the need is part of an overall plan in the community, that brings weight to your application as well. Those people will also work with you and bottom out to what's realistic and practical. And then they'll have the policy knowledge and the know-how to write an application. So someone like that, it may be a few quid, but it may be money well spent. I think that's one thing I often think, particularly when you're talking the bigger money, it could be small money in the overall scheme of things. And in many things, like the first phase of the rural regeneration, there can be money for that type of work in some of the schemes to allow that feasibility work to be done. And I think that's important to look at that as well. So I'd just like to finish up with that, just to thank our guests, the four guests, and the minister's already gone, Teresa, Alan, and Enda, for giving the time. We will circulate the presentations. We also will take all the questions, and if there's specific questions, a number of them would be geared towards the minister around funding and cuts and budgets and some things like that. We'll get responses from the minister in relation to some of them. I did say we had the funding booklet as well that's available if people want it. It's an overview. We could put along with Teresa's slides. I know are brilliant in terms of the framework of the planning or the funding options. I would say as well, we may revisit sort of in detail, like Teresa's work, or in detail the national funding areas that overnight, because I think we really need to go through. Tonight was more about giving people a flavour of, and the type of questions we had tonight were probably a bit technical to go through them all. So we may look at European lending from Teresa if she's available some other night, and equally the likes of Alan or somebody to talk us through the national funding options as well on another occasion. If there's an interest for it, we'd be glad to do it. And yet again, I'd like to thank everyone for coming on board. We had approximately 150 people on tonight, and we did go up until we were due to quit it at half, and we've gone 20 minutes over time. But at half, we'd most of them people still on it, which I think was the level of engagement we had. So thanks to everyone for engaging and staying with us, and thanks to all the speakers as well. And look, hopefully we'll catch up with you all again soon. Thanks, everybody.
Well done to yourself, Colm. It was a great initiative, and I'm sure it's very, very helpful to so many communities across. So well done yourself and your team for putting that together.
Well, thanks for that. But I think the thing here too is we need to keep this engagement going for everybody, that it's an ongoing engagement. And that's the challenge. It's easy to do a one-off one night, but we'll try and keep a list of people that were involved. We'll keep in touch with them and try and keep that communication going. And thanks again, everybody.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.